Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. This is my 121st show. So right today, you see me with no background, and that's because I'm using my iPad today as we're having a technical issue with my own camera. But today we're thrilled to have Kay Formanek, author of Beyond D&I, Leading Diversity with Purpose and Inclusiveness. And this is such a timely topic and one that's on a global basis, not just the US, but on a global basis. So Kay, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here, Marc.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. So let's start off with, why did you write this book? And by the way, I love the charts in this book.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I wrote the book because I missed finding a book that provides leaders strategic tools to develop the narrative for diversity and for developing a capability roadmap. What I found in my career, which spanned 35 years, that often organizations talk about diversity, but when you really prod them in terms of, so what do you do then? You got mixed replies. Not much confidence. So that is the aim of the book, to provide leaders with some confidence on this subject.
And before we get into the book, tell the audience a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up in South Africa, and that is a very, very important element for my work. I studied in South Africa and the United States, also in Europe. And then I became a consulting and eventually partner managing director of Accenture. It's a global professional services organization. I worked there for 25 years. And then I retired to focus my entire next chapter in my life to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion within organizations, also within society, under an organization that is now global called Diversity and Performance.
So, how do you define diversity and inclusion as it relates to corporations?
I love the question, because actually when you ask people, so what is diversity and inclusion? There are many different answers, and it's so important to have a shared vocabulary. So diversity in corporations is when there is a talent profile that is made up of individuals with varying characteristics that lead to a richer view on the environment. And when I talk about characteristics, I divide it into two big buckets. The one set of characteristics is what we call inherited characteristics. This is how you're born, you know, my gender, my age, my ethnicity, my ability. It's something that I've been born with. That is important. We call it the demographics, but there is another container, which is what we call acquired diversity. It's, are you more of an extrovert or an introvert? Where have you lived? What is your cultural background? What is your specialization? What is even the personality type that you bring to an organization? So those are the two areas. So that is diversity. Inclusion is all about the environment that allows the diversity to deliver benefits. You know, you'll only have richer perspectives when you've got a brave space and a safe space where people can actually bring their ideas to the table without thinking they're going to be shot down.
Yeah, I think when we think of inclusion and diversity, I think we are always typically just thinking black and white and gender, but there, as you read through the book, there's a lot of different types of diversity, mental, physical, cultural. There's all kinds of things that, especially today's CEO, when you're on a global basis, you have to think about, and someone wrote in also Latino, but again, everything under the sun. When you're thinking about that, now the CEOs have to be thinking about this, because they're employing people, even small companies all over the world. I was wondering, what impact did growing up in South Africa have on you?
Considerable. Who I'm today, my lens on the world, the opportunities that I've had, and certainly my commitment to advancing diversity have all the seeds in South Africa. I grew up in South Africa during the apartheid era. That is where you had legalized segregation on the basis of race and color, yet had the opportunity to attend one of the few boarding schools for all the colors of the rainbows of students coming across from Africa. And I have to say, it was in those moments that I became really focused on why do we segregate? Why do we have bias? Why do we have in-groups, out-groups? And that is obviously where all my focus has gone to. What is the neuroscience of unconscious bias? And how do you actually mitigate that bias? So it was fundamental for me.
Well, I would think that that's probably maybe the most impactful. And how is South Africa? I'm just curious, how have they adjusted? Because now that's what, 30 years into the change?
Yes. So, when you look at South Africa, and you're right, we're looking in 1993 when Mandela became president of South Africa post-apartheid. And we're almost 30 years later. And one of the points that I make in my book is the extent to which leaders have a huge impact on diversity and inclusion. And so you saw that Mandela was an excellent inclusive leader. He was followed by Mbeki and Zuma and now Ramaphosa. And each of them have a different way of looking at diversity and inclusion. And so it's a little bit of a checkered path.
Yeah, I was wondering, what did you learn from Nelson Mandela, and did he do it right in your opinion?
Well, Nelson and Mandela, within the book, I explore some of the leading leaders, in my view, around diversity and inclusion. And what is so interesting about Mandela is almost unconsciously, in an excellent way, he looked at all the things that I talk about. He was highly committed, first of all. He talked about South Africa being a rainbow nation. He felt that you needed to move from the ravages of discriminating on color. And so he really focused on that. It's the first item that is defined in the South African Constitution. What is diversity? Secondly, his definition of diversity is that it was not a dominant group. There was a richness. You see, for example, in South Africa, they look at 13 different official languages. And that is important because what he is really saying is that there's no group that is greater or more privileged than the other, each having the right to celebrate in their culture. One thing that is very important is he instituted the Truth and Reconciliation process. And I think many organizations should also be doing that as well. But what the Truth and Reconciliation process was, is that people who had been discriminated in the past on the basis of their color had the opportunity to tell their stories. And by telling the stories, there was healing. So he did many things. I mean, we'll be talking maybe about the Springboks later, but he was very focused about what are the things that I can create communities around where we have a shared aspiration. So he was an excellent leader.
Yeah, I gathered that from reading the book. And of course, we've all seen the movies, and he's so incredibly popular here in the United States and around the world. You wrote that diversity and inclusion shouldn't be a nice to have, but a must have. In the book, you mentioned some of the statistics that support this. Tell us what your research shows.
So, when I'm looking at diversity, and actually corporations, organizations have been focusing on diversity and inclusion really since the 1960s, spending billions on it. And yet there's still a sense that it's a little bit of a check box process. And what I really do is make a case of why it's so important. And I'm going to start with the Gen Z, or Generation Z, as we call it in Europe. But it is a generation that are very committed to diversity, equity, and really celebrate that. So first of all, if you're wanting to tap into that group, you're going to have to take it seriously, and you're going to have to define a richer term around diversity. Secondly, ever since I think 2007, we've tabulated why diversity, when it's connected to inclusion, has an impact on performance. And it relates to more innovation and creativity. It is related to more engagement. It is related to better customer understanding and satisfaction. You're looking at less fraud. You're looking at return on equity. So, from a business case, there's a very important one. And then what I'm seeing is that many people, when they're looking really at the sustainability of the world, it could be looking at the 17 sustainability goals. It is just the right thing to do, many people are saying, to have a more sustainable world. So there is a big narrative around diversity, and it is becoming more and more important.
Yeah. Harvard's done many studies on this and has shown that the return could be as high as a 30% return on equity by having this, and it just makes common sense, right? I mean, of course, you'd want to have a diversity of experiences and views of life and different ways of looking at how to solve a problem, as opposed to everybody growing up the same way and coming from the same background. You work with 50 organizations, or maybe more than 50 organizations. Are some of the countries and industries more inclusive than others?
It's a great question, because obviously the environment, the societal environment, has such an impact in terms of the operations of the organizations. And there are many worldwide inclusiveness index studies on nations. And what you'll see is the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Canada are some of the leading nations in terms of being inclusive on the inclusive index. You also find United States, but it's coming more from the perception of the focus around inclusiveness for women, less so on some of the other dimensions. And then you will have, in fact, those countries who are less inclusive. And those are typically the countries that are quite autocratic, hierarchical in terms of the societal norms. And as a result, you don't have, especially on the inclusiveness side, a situation where people feel that they are brave and safe to bring their points of view to discussions.
Yeah, and of course, we're seeing that as some of those countries try to stop people from voicing their opinion about anything in Russia, China, and some of these other countries, which is unfortunate for the people who live there and for the world at large. What are the leadership and corporate cultural signs that a company sees the value and embraces it?
There are a number of telltale signs. The first one is that these corporations are not pushing the diversity, inclusion, equity charter to a function. It is something that is really embraced as a charter from leadership, but also held by the people and the ambassadors within the organization. The next one is that diversity and inclusion are connected to the very strategic mandate and goals of an organization. So, for example, Unilever, they all say diversity and inclusion is one of our 3 strategic goals, and it's critical to us being able to serve our customers around the world and to promote gender equity. So you see these statements. You'll often see that these organizations are able to measure. I would say 90% of the organizations that I go to, if I ask them, so how much are you paying on diversity and inclusion? What is your budget? And what is the return? And what are you doing? That sense of transparency is not there. If you asked organizations in terms of, are people incentivized to be supporting what you're doing, you often don't find it. So, the organizations that are doing it well have a clear strategic narrative. There are incentives to be supporting it. People are being evaluated also in their support. There are clear measurements in terms of, are you making progress in terms of not just, the number of people, but in terms of the returns. And so those things are in place.
Question from the audience. Do you have any information for the idea of organizational justice when it comes to attracting and retaining talent, especially Gen Z, as you mentioned?
And if I could just ask, when you talk about organizational justice, if someone could just confirm what their meaning of it.
I think what they mean is in corporations themselves, is there organizational justice that's being done to make sure that people are actually getting the opportunities and they're playing on a level playing field?
Yes, and I hope that I'm answering the question as it's being proposed. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that when you talk about diversity and inclusion, there is a critical element, what we're talking about, equity. And when I talk about equity, I'm talking about access to resources, access to opportunities, and understanding that there is bias and that there needs to be remediation of that. And often from a European perspective, when we're talking about this organizational justice, we're linking it very much to equity. How are you ensuring that there is equity within the organization? So I hope, and for the person who replied to Jessie, just send me another note if I haven't answered it and I can jump onto it.
Yeah, I asked her, I wrote to her and asked her if I got it right. And if I didn't, she'll type in and I'll ask you that question in a different way. So what did it feel like for you to be an outsider when you moved to the Netherlands, and how long were you there?
Yes, when you're growing up in a country, and in this case it was South Africa, and you belong to the powerful group, you have privilege. I often say to people that they don't understand the power and the privilege and the identity that comes from it until they move to a place where they don't have it. And so, for those people who see me, I could be moving to the Netherlands, and many people might have said that I was Dutch. But actually, from a cultural background, I was an outsider. And it was a big reality for me in terms of what does it mean when you are no longer in the in-group, and what do you start doing to try to belong? So that was a fascinating experience for me. And I think, and it's such an important point that I make in the book, power, privilege, identity are things that you only experience really when you don't have it, or in a situation where you might not have it. Yes.
How has the pandemic affected D&I?
Well, a lot, and negatively. During this period, there has been a rise in bias. There has been xenophobia and racism, particularly against those of Asian descent. What you saw is there had been, from a gender parity perspective around the world, a lot of strides in the last 15 years. And what occurred within COVID, there was not a recognition that working in a hybrid or virtual mode, that the societal roles that women fulfilled often at home in terms of their duties increased because kids were not going to school, and they were being asked to work at all times of the days. And many people, McKinsey did a great research, actually many senior women decided that they would stay in an organization, but they would like to have a different type of role, not a leadership role, or people actually left the organization. And what you also see is that there was a profile in terms of your front line workers in terms of dimensions of diversity. So many people also being exposed and having more risk and not having the access to healthcare. So it's really had an impact. There were a number of organizations who kept their eye on diversity, and they made gains. But what you really see, and your question to me was, how do you know if an organization is strategically focused on diversity? During COVID, many organizations took their budget that they had applied to diversity in the past and they reallocated to other things. So you really saw that there were a group of organizations that advanced and others that really regressed during COVID as it relates to their diversity programs.
Yeah, I think there was a whole bunch that said, well, it's a nice to have, but not a must have. And then some organizations really see the value in it, and especially for long term. And they look at it and say, this is an absolute must have. And this has got to be in the same budget that we would fund the accounting department, the sales department. It's not like a sponsorship.
Yeah, that's right.
Is one gender more likely to embrace this concept, or is it strictly depending on the person?
So the unique person and their story and their background and how they've navigated through life has a pronounced impact in terms of how someone embraces diversity. What is very interesting from research is sometimes the most inclusive leaders are those who felt most excluded within their childhood and early adulthood, because they know what it means not to belong. So there is a big story in terms of the self. What I do need to say is that in many environments, society has created almost the leadership qualities or the expected leadership qualities of empathy and compassion and community and affiliation. And they almost expect that it's going to be more dominant in women. There's no genetic reason for that, but it's more societal reason. Now, all of these words that I've just mentioned, empathy, affiliation, curiosity, connectedness, are some of the traits that are critical to inclusive leaders. And so as a result, research will be saying is when we look across the players in diversity, you'll find maybe a disproportionate number of women who are really embracing this, but not exclusively, I have to say that.
Well, with politics the way it's become in the US and other G20 countries, do you see resistance to D&I? I mean, you talked about some of the companies kind of, well, you know, it was a nice to have, but we're not keeping it in the budget. We've got to reallocate the money. But on a global basis, with at least the top tier countries economically, what do you see in terms of that?
Yeah. If I may start with the United States, where I do a lot of work, what I have seen is that there has been a pronounced shift through 2016. And by the way, it didn't start in 2016. I mean, there's some research in terms of, in a 2012 study, showed that more than half of the white Americans believed, and now I quote from the report, whites have replaced blacks as the primary victims of discrimination. There is almost a sense in terms of a majority group feeling unsettled by the fact that, and I don't like using the words, but this is from the report, being perhaps a minority in the future. And as a result, it is really going to what I talk about, privilege, identity, power. You know, when people feel that there is a sense that there's going to be a loss of that, there is a concern. And what has happened in the United States, it's really become quite politicized in terms of that. Now, this degree of politicization, I don't see as much, certainly in other regions around the world, certainly not in Europe. There are some countries where you have, for example, France, you'll see that there is an increasing leaning towards the right, and it is usually on the dossier of migration and migrants coming in. So you see color, race, cultural origin being increasingly taken to the political field, but I haven't seen it to the degree that I've seen it in the United States.
Yeah, I think some cases we're going backwards. And of course, you're seeing opinions on all sides of the abortion issue where there are people writing in that they think the reason that they've overturned Roe v. versus Wade is to make sure the white population doesn't lose its majority. So it's an interesting conversations that people are having right now because of all these changes. And hopefully we as a society aren't going backwards, but are looking forward, and maybe Generation Z is going to be the answer to that going down the road. One of the questions from the audience is, what if there's a conflict of interest when it comes to a disagreement or beliefs within same organizations?
So this is a very critical question, because often people ask me, so what is the lowest common denominator of where you need to have agreement as it relates to diversity? At what level is diversity so important that you're willing to have that diversity of opinion or value or so? And I usually say it's at the level of value. What am I talking about? If you have as an organization, and you wish to have diversity of perspectives and thoughts, and you believe that that diversity will bring better decision making, then you are willing to have some discomfort. As a result, many people are saying that leaders need to be equipped to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, which often will occur within an area of diversity, because there will be difference of opinion. And my view is that what needs to be in place is an agreement, a common language of value. So at the point that you say, we want to be respectful to individuals, and there is a diversity of thought which says it's okay to be disrespectable, that you're not respectful, that would be the point that I'd say you need to make a call. So I often believe that it is at the value level, the value of transparency, the value of a respect, the value of hearing someone raise something, piggybacking. Those values are very, very important. And this is when there is a conflict at that level, my belief and my research shows that there needs to be a strong value call at that level.
I've got a question for you. Disney, they stood up against the governor and the Republicans in Florida, and now they are getting their, I guess, ownership of and control of the Disney geographic area is being taken away from them. Also, their corporate tax breaks, everything is being taken away. Is that the job of the corporation to stand up and let politicians and the public know how they feel, take a stance on something? Or is it that corporations should keep their mouths shut and worry about just getting a return on investment? What's your take on that?
Yes, within the book, I talk about it a lot. I mean, when you look at Friedman and go to the 1970s, there was a view that the role of the corporation, of the organization, is indeed to make a profit. And this domain of discussion is outside of it and will be supported by society. My strong view is that individuals, and I'm going to refer to Gen Z, these individuals are looking to organizations to take a stance. And clearly there is a continuum in terms of how much needs to be done. But what employees are very cynical about whether organizations are really committed to diversity. And what they want to do and see is that organizations are taking a stand on what they're speaking about and saying is important to them. And as a result, there needs to be a convergence of that from inside to outside. So I believe that the future employees will be expecting that more and more from the organizations. And as a result, this is why I talk about in the book the 5 stages of diversity in an organization. There are some organizations that saying we're going to do diversity because we don't want to have any penalties, legal penalties. We call it compliance stage. And then there are other organizations which we call stage 2, which says we wish to do diversity because we don't want to be penalized by our stakeholders because we're not doing enough, whether employees or customers. And there are yet other companies who are saying, we want to do diversity because we'll be more creative and innovative and we'll make more money. But there are some organizations, and we call them stage 5 organizations, who are saying, we are going to be doing diversity because we see one of our roles is to support the 17 Sustainability Development Goals, and diversity, equity, inclusiveness is one of these. That is a Unilever, for example, but there are a number of other companies. So I think to your question, organizations are being almost forced to start taking a stand.
Yeah, and you hear people on both sides of it feeling that some people feel like, hey, Disney should keep their mouth shut and focus on bringing Mickey and the right programming and overall to the community. And even Netflix has been taking a big hit, that they feel that that organization also is more focused on diversity issues and what they call wokeism than they are focused on giving a good return for the shareholders. And so it's a complex issue that CEOs are grappling with, and they don't like to see their stock go down, but I think a lot of them feel very strongly about this issue and feel like to recruit the best and brightest that they have to let them know that they will take a stand. Does that sound right?
That's right. And if I can give an example in terms of organizations that are highly committed to LGBTQ plus. So if you are a global organization and you're committed in terms of your policies, your protocols, and what you say, that you wish there to be no discrimination to your LGBTQ plus employee group. And let's say you're operating in Uganda, where in fact people who are from the LGBTQ plus can actually be sent to prison and even have a death sentence for their sexuality. The question from an organization is, so do I, look the other way because I want to work in Uganda and get my profit? Or do I say to the Ugandan country, if you want me to be operating here, I need to have these rights safeguarded. And so I think it is a very difficult narrative for an organizations to say that we believe in something in some countries, but others not, because it's going to impact our profit. You're not going to be credible to your employees or your stakeholders.
And you faced, South Africa faced a lot of that when there was a lot of pressure to pull out of South Africa or not have shares of South African companies. And maybe that did help change the path that South Africa had taken. Maybe if these people and companies themselves did not take that stance, maybe South Africa would have remained the same with apartheid.
Well, certainly the pressure and the scrutiny and the focus supported the change that occurred.
So, a question from the audience: what are some of the best ways to start having the hard conversations about D&I in an organization that perhaps doesn't recognize it and is its unconscious biases?
Good. So, when people often ask me, what is maybe one of the most important capabilities that we can build in our leaders and in our organization, I talk about the courageous conversations. We talk about courageous conversations. And these are the things that you can do. It starts by saying that it is important, because otherwise people don't know why you're having these conversations. So what I suggest to a leader is to start with this. Diversity for us means this. And it's important to us as an organization because ... And it's important to us as leaders because ... However, diversity is more than just talking about it. It's actually operating it, behaving it. And unfortunately, but this is how we are built, each of us have unconscious biases. And the way to actually understand the unconscious biases is to speak about it. And then what you can introduce is what I have run for a number of organizations around the world, which we call deep listening sessions. What happens is a leader invites people from the organization, in fact, to listen, not to give answers, simply to listen. And the question is, what would cause you to feel more included or have more of a sense of belonging? What is getting in the way from you? And give examples. And in fact, often in these facilitated conversations, because you're making about agreements of safety and respect and confidentiality and listening, what you start getting out is the small microaggressions. It's a difficult word because micro seems that it's a small thing, but usually the impact is huge. But what are the small things that are happening? Usually blind spots, unconscious biases that cause people to feel excluded. And once you talk about it and start tabulating, what you have in hand is the ability to talk about, so how do we move past it? And so this is what we talk about, courageous conversations. What you need, however, is that people believe that you're committed to this and that there is the safety for people to be able to speak out.
We saw that certainly during the election where people felt stifled doing that and wanted to speak out about what was going on in this country, and that they felt that we were going in the wrong direction, which impacts the rest of the world. Could you please tell us about the 5 elements of an integrated approach to diversity, and why did you pick those 5?
Yeah. So already about 20 years ago, a researcher, Stefano, and has been built on, showed that if an organization says, oh, we want diversity and we want more people of this and that and this and that, but you don't have the inclusion, that environment which people are feeling that they can belong and are included. In fact, the return on the diversity will decrease versus increase. So already about 20 years ago, there was a clarity that in order to get benefits of different perspectives, better decision-making, et cetera, from diversity, you need that inclusion. Now, I introduced the 3rd element, which is leadership, because actually what we are seeing is that the behaviors of leaders, and when I talk about a leader, it's not just the board of directors or the presidents, it's actually anyone who's responsible for a team of 2 or more people, that their behaviors and actions have a 70% impact on how an environment is evaluated as being inclusive. So so you need the diversity, you need the inclusion, but you need the leadership that is embodying the behaviors which allow an inclusive environment to occur. The 2 other elements that I talk about is purpose. When people are not clear why this is important, and whether an organization say it's the ethical and moral thing to do, or we're doing it because we believe we're going to get a better return on our equity, or we're doing it because our clients are saying that it's critical, people need to understand why this is worth worrying about and committing to. So that is the purpose. And the last but not least is what I've been speaking about quite a lot, which is equity, which is access to resources. Because if you are opening your doors to people with different perspectives, and they do not have the access to opportunities, to sponsorship, they are not going to be able to contribute. So you need that equity, and we can talk about what can be done there, but these are the elements. So diversity plus inclusion plus equity plus leadership plus purpose. This is what my research is showing is fundamental to be integrating around a diversity journey.
How do companies, let's say of 10 or more people, justify not having a diverse team?
So there are some organizations who are saying, look, we're not really impacted by an external world that is demanding this. We are a small team. We are focusing on efficiency. We wish to have quick dialogue, shared understanding, and it allows us to be moving fast. So, some organizations are there who are saying, actually, I don't need it. Clearly, they can't discriminate because that is legalized against it, but they are not seeing the benefit. What you're usually seeing is organizations who are interacting with an external world, that are dependent on getting talent, who are dependent on servicing clients who are expecting more and more in organizations in terms of diversity. I don't see many organizations that can say this is not important to us. But there are a few homogeneous teams who are really focused on efficiency. They've got a going concern, and they say, we're not going to focus on it.
Could you please explain what is importance of the 5 elements of the virtuous cycle?
Yeah, the virtuous circle is these 5 elements of, diversity and equity, inclusion, leadership, and purpose. And what you see is that when people have their eye on those 5 elements and they understand the clarity in the narrative, they understand the role of leadership to embody the behaviors of inclusive leadership, when it's clear about what dimensions of diversity are important, when they are focused on creating equity, de-biasing processes, that you really have a virtuous circle.
Yeah, you write about understanding diversity maturity, and one of the stages is legal compliance. What size company do you have to be where this becomes a compliance issue?
Well, in different countries, and even in the states, in the various states in the United States, already you're having legislation where you're saying organizations that have more than 20 people need to be reporting, need to be focusing. But even from legislation, even if you're an organization with 3 people and there is sexual harassment of a member of the team, you're going to have compliance issues because there's going to be a lawsuit. So compliance is about, these are the organizations who say, we are going to, at a bare minimum, ensure we don't have any legal class actions. We are not going to have any quota penalties. We're going to deliver on the law within our state or within our country. It is the bare minimum. And most organizations are really at stage 3 where they're looking at, how do I make diversity have an impact in my performance?
How do you also make the people who are impacted by the diversity initiatives feel that they're not being left out? Because I think, we're seeing a lot of that being posted online, especially in the US, where white America feels like, well, now I'm at the very bottom and somebody else is being given a job that I may be qualified or even better qualified for. But in search of diversity, which they want fairness, I think most people want that, they feel like now it's reverse discrimination on them. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. Look, there are a number of things that we have to be very careful about in diversity. The one is that in organizations where diversity is about others versus yourself, you will feel like you're excluded immediately. And this is why for any of the diversity programs, what I try to do is define diversity, the uniqueness of each individual being able to bring their thinking and their experiences. The next thing is that many people believe that diversity is a zero-sum game, or it means that the pie is becoming smaller. For many organizations that are talking about how diversity will create more opportunities, more revenue, you're actually talking about the pie becoming larger. It's not about losing the job. It's being able to create additional jobs. The other way that you can do, and I have seen some excellent examples, is the compensation and the impact on job and success and promotions for people who might not be in the so-called minority, but who are playing their role. In Europe, we call it manbassadors, people who lean in, men and women who lean in for others, and you've got some incentives around that. So I think what is really important, once again, is that strategic narrative, which isn't that diversity is about offering jobs for others. It's about how together do we create value through diversity where you have a role and are incentivized to play that role.
I have to say, I find it sad and maybe a bit insulting to the public that the NFL, the National Football League, has to require that they interview at least one Black coach when it should be an automatic that they would be interviewing these folks and they would be getting the jobs. In the last round of coaches being hired, there were at least 2 or 3 highly qualified Black coaches that didn't even get interviewed. And that blows my mind that that would be the case, especially when you look at the NFL, as 67% of the players are Black. Not that they have to hire Black coaches, but that they have to make a rule that they have to interview at least one of the 3 candidates has to be Black. I mean, it's astounding today that that would even need to be said, but it still needs to be said here.
And it is, you talked about bias, but it is when there is a strong culture of an in-group or a dominant culture, you almost unwittingly think about members of your dominant group. You have to have reminders. You need to have incentives. You need to have goals to say, do not default to the past thinking. And so as a result, you're seeing many organizations which are saying we want to have equal slates. Just as an aside, I did some research which said, what is the impact, by the way, of saying of every 4 candidates, 1 has to be a person of color or 1 has to be a woman of the 4 candidates. And in fact, what you see, and this was reported in Harvard by a researcher, even that stipulation has translates to a very small uplift in the chance or probability in that person being recruited. And the reason is it's the one of the 3. It's still a minority. It's actually only when you have an equal slate that you start seeing that there is more recruitment across the board.
There was mention of inclusive leadership certification. I wasn't aware of this. Are boards and investors expecting their leaders to go through this type of training and show tangible results?
Oh, yes. It is one of the things that I had mentioned is that when I left Accenture, where I was responsible for diversity and inclusion and equity and a sponsoring partner, what I did is actually work as a visiting lecturer at INSEAD and at a number of other business schools. And what I was looking at is what are leaders needing to navigate this next period of time. And what I was getting back from leaders is I know diversity is important. However, they describe themselves, I'm not a diverse candidate. Who am I to actually lead this? I'm not comfortable doing this. And yet, a Deloitte research said that perhaps one of the most important capabilities of organizations is having this inclusive leadership capability because of the diversity that we're going to see within organizations. So in fact, many boards and investors are going through the certification because they want to be equipped to understand, what do we mean by diversity? What are the traits of an inclusive leader? What is unconscious bias? How do I mitigate it? How do I deal with microaggressions in my organization? What are the policies that are really adding value? So all of these type of questions and more, leaders are actually going through, because they are saying, in order to lead my organization, I need to be equipped to have this conversation and navigate it.
Yeah, I believe that they need to even be teaching this in business schools. They were, for a while, they were teaching ethics when that was a big problem. It's always a problem, but when it really explodes. And yet I don't think, and I taught at Wharton for 10 years, I don't think that they have a class in diversity and inclusion and how to manage and grow a diverse workforce. Do you know of any schools that are, especially in the MBA programs, that are making this one of the mandates?
Yes. So, for example, in INSEAD, and this, it starts, INSEAD is a business school, one of the best in the world. But, if you look at their mandate, and it starts again in terms of the mandate, it says, one of our key pillars is diversity. Why? Because our MBA has to equip people to be working in teams with many characteristics that are culturally, gender, ethnicity, because leaders of the future are going to have to be able to do that. And what you're starting seeing is that many organizations are having it as an elective, and now within MBAs, it's becoming a mandatory course of that. And I think absolutely it needs to be. And also from an executive education, you're seeing that more and more business schools are giving this inclusive learning and leadership. I saw that Jesse said there's a great difference between representation and inclusion. And I just want to say, absolutely. Diversity is, about the representation. Without the inclusion, that representation isn't able to sort of deliver to the environment. So absolutely, yes.
Yesterday, I was speaking with an Asian woman in the entertainment industry, and she felt that companies and universities are putting a cap on hiring Asians and admitting them to schools, and felt that people's credentials should be shown without name, picture, so people are judged on their experience and merits. This relates to your recommendations on eliminating bias. What's your take on that?
So actually, research is divided a little bit on this. The first thing that I need to say is that when you look at resumes, hobbies, pictures, age, name, nationality, are all things that are regarded as the greatest triggers for recruitment bias. So depending on your name, the chance of being invited for an interview can decrease from 7 out of 10 to 3 out of 10. And likewise, in terms of your school or your age, etc. So that is clear. Now, the issue, however, is that if you have an organization that is highly committed to diversity and would like to identify candidates, when you anonymize everything, you don't give the opportunity to, in fact, invite it. And what you sometimes see is in the very way that someone sets up their resume, it is within a sort of dominant way of doing it, which, just how you write your resume is a giveaway in terms of your background and your nationality, etc. So what I'm saying is that you need to be very careful about the triggers, But if you're taking all the identifiers for organizations who are really wanting to have diversity, that can be also a problem.
The story of Nelson Mandela, and we talked about this in the beginning, and the Springboks, did I pronounce that right? Springboks
Yes.
rugby team, which was made into a movie with Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman, which was a seminal moment in your country's history. Please explain the importance and what organizations can learn from this.
So what happened was that the Springboks have an emblem. So the Springboks relates to the team that plays rugby. Rugby is a great sport in South Africa, but rugby was a sport that was really confined to what they called the Afrikaners. It's the white populations speaking Afrikaans, and in fact, it was regarded as even quite a discriminatory a group of people, because there were very few people of color who were admitted or allowed to play. So when Mandela actually was elected president, one of the first things that people said is that you should get rid of the Springboks. You know, maybe you call the team the Proteas or something else. Let's create a new emblem. And what he found, or what Mandela felt, is that there was an opportunity to get an organization, a country around an emblem by getting behind the team. And as a result, he said, no, what you'll see is that there's going to be resentment from the people who've lost now a lot of rights and privileges. Let's not throw out the emblem, but let's get the country behind it. And obviously, these were the scenes of how he met the team, how he met the coach, how he attended the games, how he came wearing the Springbok shirt in terms of Ellis Park, and how, in fact, in that year, I think it was 1994, that the Springboks won the World Cup. And I think it is a beautiful story, because when you have diversity, what you need is to create the connectors, the connections, the emblems, the moments of celebration amongst people who are diverse, perhaps in terms of how they look or their characteristics, but who are united in terms of some of the symbols. And that's what he did very well.
It was a great movie as well. I'm surprised to read that women involved in the job market was stagnating with growing financial disparities that you write in the book. Why is that, and how can that be rectified? And why does it take 3 times as long to make the difference in North America compared to Western Europe?
So it's really got its seat within COVID. And during that time, and I am thankful that people are talking about mental health and how do we support mental health and how do we create a hybrid working environment. But what you saw is that some women were actually working 4.5 hours more per day because they were trying to combine something. And by the way, this is also for parents. I'm not only saying that it was predominantly women, but it was parents. And as a result, you had, as I said, women leaving the job market because there was difficulty in terms of combining. Now, I think there is a great opportunity in terms of, dare we say, post-COVID, with organizations thinking about what is the new reality. How can we create this virtual environment with a hybrid environment? How do we learn from the lessons? How do we create opportunities? I think, as I say in the book, there is really a moment of truth now in terms of how do organizations operationalize their business model to allow for more diversity through virtual working.
Here we are, we're at the final minute here, and I'm wondering, lastly, with politics, especially in the US, going to extremes, many people mocking the concept of wokeism, and with all the loss of diversity momentum, will Generation Z make sure this happens? Is that what you're seeing?
So Gen Z, I'm a mother, three kids, 2 daughters, a son. And what I see is that they are less biased. In fact, the younger generations are less biased because they've got the social network and they are influenced, and they are really believing in a lot of things that diversity, inclusiveness is important. So I think that Gen Z is very important, but I think leaders who are still at the top of our corporations, who are not the Gen Z in the main, have such an important responsibility for tapping into Gen Z, creating reverse mentoring. So I think it's the leaders and the Gen Z working together.
Well, Kay, I have to say thank you so much for spending the time today. And your book was fabulous. And I think every leader needs to read this book, not just corporations, but on all spectra of leadership. So I'm hoping that we're going to have you back again when you write another book about this and see how much progress we've made over time.
Thank you so much. And I want to say also this audience for their questions, and Marc, just for an amazing podcast. So thank you so much.
Thank you again. Have a great weekend, everybody. Please take care.
Take care.